So by the common law that was in effect in the United States in the early 19th century, women lost their legal personality when they married. This was known as the system of coverture. A woman is under the cover of her husband, whereas William Blackstone, who was the leading expositor of the common law, by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in the law. And that meant that the married woman's property became her husband's property, that she couldn't sue or make contracts on her own behalf. All of that was now up to her husband. And it gave him a great deal of power that she didn't have to own and manage her own property. Of course, that was also at that time a woman didn't have a vote in the political sphere either. That was assumed. It was assumed again that her husband represented her in the political sphere. This became a particular concern to a group of women who became politically active in the early 19th century, first in the anti-slavery movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were women who first found their voice politically advocating on behalf of slaves. And as they became involved with the abolitionist movement, as they traveled to England to go to international anti-slavery conventions, they found that their right to speak in public politically was challenged because they were women. And so they found their own consciousness, political consciousness raised, and they started to think about the position of women and to draw analogies between that of the African slave and of women under coverture, and to say that to be a married woman was like slavery, that one was fully dependent on a husband like a master, and that he had, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, how like slaves ye men hold your women. And so they began to think about reform in the United States on behalf of women. And although they were interested in gaining the vote, suffrage, voting rights was not their primary aim in the first part of the 19th century. They were much more focused on reforming the laws of property that they thought shackled married women, and in fighting coverture. And in particular, they had to fight the idea that coverture was somehow chivalrous and actually benefited women. Blackstone wrote that even the disabilities that a wife lies under are really intended for her protection and benefit. He said, so great a favorite is the female sex of the laws. And so they had to fight the idea that they were on a pedestal and being protected, and try to show the ways that they were really harmed by this law. Now, it was true that some wealthy women were able to get around these laws through loopholes, through premarital agreements, and by going to equity courts and getting judges to make special arrangements for wealthy families to protect their property. And what in 1848, the first women's rights convention in the world was held at Seneca Falls, New York, July of 1848, and Stanton and Anthony led this convention in preparing a Declaration of Sentiments. It was modeled on the Declaration of Independence, and it started out, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And it went on in the model of the Declaration of Independence to talk about the history of mankind as a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, not on the part of George III, but on the part of men toward women. Most of their resolutions were about the rights of women to hold property. Only the 12th resolution was about gaining the vote. And they did have some effect. They also petitioned the legislature in New York. And in 1848, New York, only a few months later, New York did pass married women's property reform laws that allowed married women the right to keep their own property after marriage and to get gifts separately. It wasn't until 1860 that was amended to include earnings from wages. It wasn't only a product of the reform efforts of women's rights workers. It was also about, there were other forces that were interested as well. in making this change, in particular people who were concerned about protecting debtors from creditors. But it was a significant victory for the first women's rights reformers. And of course, it took another 60 years before the vote the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was finally passed and women gained the right to vote. But this was the first important victory for women's rights in the United States.